Well, hello and welcome to Great God Debates. I am doing another episode in the car, which, as I said, not necessarily going to be all the time, but I have something on my mind that I just wanted to share with you now. And that is that I've just started reading a book called Misquoting Jesus by Bart Erhman. Now, some of you may have heard of him, some of you haven't. He's a biblical scholar, in particular of the New Testament, one of many. He used to be a believer, and from what I've heard about it before, I don't think he is anymore. It sounds a Christian, or somebody that was calling him a Christian. He hasn't necessarily explicitly said that in the book so far, but the way I've only read the introduction and chapter 1 so far, but it's already interesting, and he has alluded to the suggestion that he's no longer a believer. As far as I'm aware, though, from what he's written so far and what I'd heard about him before, he does believe that Jesus actually did exist. So he's not a Jesus mythicist, and he definitely believed that Jesus existed. That's at least what I'm reading so far. Now, it may well be that I'll read on and find that actually that's not his position, but just the way he's talking at the moment seems to suggest that he does. But it's interesting because it talks about how we have come to get the Bible as we do now, in particular the New Testament, and it talks about the fact that around that time, or rather sort of prior to then, Judaism itself was almost a standout religion in that it was more a bookish religion. It was surrounded by doctrine, books, whereas many religions around at the time, of which there were thousands essentially, weren't book based. They were all about sacrifices to gods, which obviously we find in the Old Testament, but they didn't really find any, well, there was, often stuff was passed down by word of mouth and tradition, family traditions in particular. Often it was polytheism that sort of was the main religions of the day. I think monotheism was pretty much came about in Judaism, as far as I've read so far, and it was about sacrifice to the gods for the most part, in terms of other religions, and there weren't really things written down, as I say, and so there wasn't really any doctrine to follow, any moral sort of guidance as such. But he makes a point that that wasn't to say that, you know, people that practice these religions weren't moral, and they didn't practice good things. It's just that they didn't derive their good things or their moral practices from religion, whereas we find that Judaism does prescribe certain values and morals and things like that, and that sort of went on into Christianity as well. But he also talks about the fact that we have no surviving original copies of the Christian writings, of the early Christian writings. What we have seem to be copies of translations, which I've mentioned before. That's sort of, this is sort of affirming what I have read before. Now, I will be reading other books as well. I mean, I have sort of read other stuff in the past, but I'm very interested in reading more. But in this particular book I'm reading at the moment seems to say that we have no originals. Lots of it is copies of originals. But it's also saying that very early on in the Christian faith, they were very, very book orientated. It was very, the faith itself was literate, as in it was lots of things were written down, and yet many of the followers were illiterate, and that was very common at the time for people to be illiterate, particularly uneducated. Now, before I go any further, don't think that I'm trying to say that believers are uneducated or illiterate. The point he's trying to make is that at the time, early Christians, many of them, perhaps the majority of them were uneducated and illiterate. Take that as you will. That's not to say that it's wrong or anything like that. However, it would appear that what was constituted as a literate person was also vague as well. He alludes to the fact that, and I will, because I haven't got the book at the moment, I can't remember the names that he gave, but it was alluded to the fact that somebody potentially was considered a literate person simply if they could sign their name, and often they were sort of counted as the village scribe, if you like, somebody who could literally do that and wasn't necessarily great at anything else, which is interesting as well, because with the New Testament writings, obviously the people that wrote them would have been more literate, but the followers weren't necessarily. And several books of the New Testament, often books that are ascribed to Paul, although they're suggesting that they're, I can't remember the word, pseudo something, I can't remember, but it sort of, people must have written, some people wrote books of the Bible that were ascribed to Paul, that they were written in his name but weren't necessarily written by him. But I mean, by the by, a lot of it was encouraging people like village scribes and the village sort of readers to read them out to other people. So we've got potential literate people writing books that were passed on to people who were considered to be a village scribe, that weren't necessarily the most literate themselves. So we may have had things read incorrectly, perhaps, and it highlights the importance of the particular passages that talk about Jesus appearing to a crowd of 500. And often the arguments that are given, well, you know, when this was written out, these people would have still been alive, potentially, so we're told, to have attested to this, and they would have caused a bit of a stink, if want for a better word, if this hadn't have happened. But we may have then had these scribes read things incorrectly. They may not have been written out, or read out rather, as it was written. But also, as I said, we don't have the originals. We have copies of translations of copies. But back then, the last thing he alludes to in chapter 1 is that the question is, because we don't have the level of sort of typing that we do, we don't have computers, and all the things that we have today that we can easily copy books out so they are accurate to their originals, who then copied these books to be read out then to different places? Because they weren't all read out, and the books that they were collated, there wasn't just one copy of them. They had to be several copies written out in order to be collected and collated, if you like, for different villages. So how do we know? How can we be confident that the copies that were made even at the time were indeed accurate when not everybody was entirely literate? And that's sort of where it's left off at chapter 1, but it's an interesting point and question to ask. I assume he's going to go on to give his verdict of the answer. And I'm not saying that because he's written all this that it must be right and we read that everything is accurate because he's written it, because that would be the same mistake that I'd make, that I would always be hypocritical for me to say that when I say, well, we can't just say the Bible's true because the Bible says it's true. But he seems to have done a lot of research, and we'll see what others have said about it as well. But this so far is really interesting, because if this is what we know of history, then it may suggest that even the things that were copied out to then be read to other people weren't necessarily as accurate as we think they may be. So things like the 500 witnesses may not have been an accurate story, and they may not have been read correctly because they're copied incorrectly potentially to the people that were supposedly would have been around at the time to have contested it if it was wrong. So there's already lots of discrepancies. but I will leave it there for now. Thank you for watching, and tune in again. Bye bye.